A friend of mine told me this story about a girl she met from Sweden who was staying with her as a couch surfer. The girl was in her mid-20s, and while my friend told me her name, I never remembered it. Just the content of this horrific story that will never leave my mind. So this girl, let's call her Jane, was driving to her mother's house. They lived far out of the city and in a highly forested area. There were no streetlights and not a lot of houses. If there were houses, they were built back into the forest, with long winding driveways before any sight of life. So Jane was a late teenager, driving back to her mother's home in the late evening. As she was driving, something up ahead on the road caught her eye. It was a small bundle next to the road, and as her car passed the bundle, she was shocked. It looked like a baby wrapped up in a blanket. Jane smashed the brakes, stopping 50 meters up the road. She revered back a little and then jumped out of the car as quickly as she could, thinking that someone had abandoned a baby on the road. Jane ran over to the bundled-up blanket and exhaled a sigh of relief. It was just a toy baby. Just as she had picked up the baby, she saw headlights coming down the road in front of her. Suddenly realizing she was standing on the road alone at night, she ran quickly back to her car and jumped in, chucking on the engine and driving off. The car behind her sped up, coming up really close to the back of her car and tooting its horn at her. Jane was panicking. She started driving faster and faster, constantly checking her rearview mirror. Although she couldn't who was in the car behind her, she was still terrified. Eventually, she reached her mother's driveway, which was still about 2 kilometers long. Her mother lived deep in the forest. She thought to herself that if the car followed her down the driveway, she would call her mother and tell her to ring the police. And as she turned onto the driveway, the car behind her also turned into the driveway, still very close behind her. I remember part of the story was that she kept thinking back to the baby toy and how creepy the evening had been. Jane got out her phone and called her mother. She told her she was being followed and to call the police. She was expected to arrive in about 5 minutes. The car was still following very close, and both cars were going way too fast for the type of road and for no streetlights. Jane could see nothing but what was being lit by her headlights and the headlights of her pursuer. Then she saw her mother's house in the distance of her headlights. The pursuers still very close behind her, still beeping the horn so loudly Jane's ears rang. As she got to the house, she jumped out of the car. Her mother was standing at the front of the house waiting for her with a kitchen knife in her hand. Jane ran up to her as quickly as she could. The car that was following also stopped, and the doors of the car flew open. An elderly couple jumped out of the car and were yelling and pointing to Jane's car. "Someone got into your car!" they screamed. As Jane was realizing what had happened, a man jumped out of the back seat of Jane's car and ran into the forest. Everyone just looked at each other in shock as Jane realized what had just happened. The car coming down the road had seen someone jump into her car when she stopped to check on the baby. It was most likely they had left it there on the road, watching for people to stop, taking advantage of people's kindness. As I said at the start of this post, a friend of mine told me this story, and I believe it to be true. If anyone else has heard of this, send a comment. I don't believe it was the guy's first time trying this. Always lock your doors when you get out of your car. I have trouble going to sleep at night. I won't whine and complain about having false insomnia. I just can't go to sleep at night. Some say I have an anxiety problem. Others say I just need to take pills. But I've never gone to a doctor about it. Instead, I just get in my truck and drive around for about an hour at night to relax and unwind. Usually it works, and while expensive, I sleep well through the night with no problems. I live in Lubbock, Texas. For those of you who know the area, you know that once you leave Lubbock, it's several miles in either direction before you reach another town. The highways leading out of Lubbock go through miles of flat nothingness before reaching another town. And even then, the towns are so small you could throw a stone across the town and it'd be out before it hits the ground. Driving on Highway 84. It's a long way from Lubbock to Littlefield, the nearest large town to the city. It's a nice drive to make when you're alone. Very calm, quiet, and dark. The kind of drive that almost puts you to sleep behind the wheel. On this particular night, it was a typical cold late January night. I had recently started up classes at Texas Tech again and was feeling a bit stressed. So I do what I always do around midnight when I can't sleep. I grab my keys, throw on a coat, grab a small cup of warm coffee, and drive. I took Highway 84 that night as I hadn't driven the road since I had come back from winter break. As I passed Shallowater that began the long stretch of open road between Shallowater and Anton. I was no more than a fourth of the way to Anton when I heard a tap on my passenger window. I figured it was a rock and ignored it, but then I heard it again and again and again. 3 distinct taps on my passenger window, like someone was trying to get my attention. I turned my head to look out the window. To this day, I wish I hadn't. Staring back at me with dark black irises was a man. His face was pale, almost gray, sitting in the dead center of the window, smiling. That smile was the most evil thing I have ever seen. He bore all of his teeth in a wide smile. They were pearly white, and not one of them was out of place. His hair was jet black and short, almost like something out of the 1950s. But that smile, the never-ending grin he bore, has been etched into my mind permanently. I jumped and jerked my truck slightly into the other lane before recovering and straightening out again. I had taken my eye off the window, hoping what I had seen was just a hallucination of some kind. I looked back, and he was still there, just smiling at me like he had been waiting to see me. He raised his hand and started waving at me. I turned my head forward and stared straight ahead. I jerked my truck into the left lane and then swung it back into the right. But I didn't look to see if he was gone. I was too afraid to look. I kept telling myself to keep my eyes on the road and find a place to turn around. Then I see something out of the corner of my eye. I glance over and it's a man, running on all fours, naked. My jaw dropped. I looked at my speedometer. 75. I look back, it's him. Smiling at me again. I floored it and raced away from the guy. I heard him jump into the back of my truck. I checked my rearview mirror and there he is, staring back at me through the mirror, still smiling. I'm almost in tears. I just want him to go away. I find a turnaround, slam on the brakes, and check my rearview. He never moved. It was like he had no momentum at all. I didn't even look to make the turn. I just did it and hit the gas as soon as I was on the road again. I can't even be bothered to do the speed limit. As far as I'm concerned, this was an emergency. I returned to Lubbock without the thing in my truck. I know this because as I turned onto my street, he was standing on my front porch, waving to me. It was past midnight, a beautiful night with a full moon bathing the West Virginia road in an eerie light. Despite the scenic view, I hated driving this late. The road, familiar from countless college trips, coiled through twists and turns over cliffs and dense forests. A daytime delight, it morphed into a nightmare after dark. Halfway home, my car sputtered and died. Luckily, a small store loomed ahead. Coasting in, I parked, hoping the usual engine hiccup would resolve itself. No luck. My phone, as if in cahoots, was dead too. Stuck. The nearest house was miles away, and the welcome I'd receive was a gamble. Sighing, I stepped out, the silence broken only by the crickets. Then, headlights pierced the darkness. Relief washed over me as I frantically flagged down the approaching car, but it sped past, leaving me cold. A screech of tires shattered the quiet, followed by a horrific crash. My heart hammered as I raced towards the sound, grabbing my emergency flashlight. The road ended in a sheer drop, shrouded darkness below. For what felt like an eternity, I scanned the wreckage. Nothing. No car lights, no skid marks, not even a disturbed patch of gravel. A pit formed in my stomach. Desperate, I tried my phone again. This time, the screen sprang to life. Dialing 911, I stammered out the events, my breaths ragged. 10 agonizing minutes crawled by, punctuated by faint cries for help echoing from the abyss. Each yell spurred me on. But with the arrival of flashing lights, the cries abruptly stopped. An hour-long search yielded nothing. No car, no injured man, only my vehicle and the emergency crew. My explanation was met with disbelief, bordering on a prank charge. One officer, however, seemed to listen. He revealed a chilling story. A year ago, a similar accident happened here. No witnesses. The couple, though injured, crawled back to the road, but the husband succumbed before help arrived. The officer, haunted by the past, understood. He dismissed the charges and advised me to rest. As I turned the key, the engine roared to life. Relief flooded me, but as I pulled away, a faint echo pierced the night. A man's desperate plea for help. I shuddered, the memory forever etched in my mind.